All right. Well, this is awesome, everyone. As you all continue to file in, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off here. So welcome to Spoonflower Craft Fridays 2023. My name is Alexa, and I'm Spoonflower's Maker Community Manager. I'm so excited to be hosting our Craft Fridays session today with Robert, who I'll formally introduce in just a moment. But for those of you who have joined us in the past, Craft Fridays might look a little bit different this year. So in the past, we've held this event on Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving here in the US, and packed multiple pre-recorded events into one day. And so this year we are bringing you 4 real-time workshops spread across 4 separate weeks, so you can settle in and get crafty with us and some super talented members of our creative community. So I will drop our Craft Fridays announcement link in the chat now so that you can be sure to register for our final event if you haven't already, which is a session on block printing with Allison Toon Aguilar. But today we'll be working with some pressed botanicals and learning how to add embroidered embellishments to a finished tea towel featuring those pressed botanical designs. But before I introduce today's instructor, I want to just go ahead and get a couple of housekeeping things out of the way. So first is a reminder that today's session is being recorded. Also, if you are not signed up for Spoonflower emails, this is the best way to stay updated on events just like this at Spoonflower. So we can drop a link to subscribe in the chat now. I will be monitoring the chat throughout today's session and taking care of as many questions as I can. You can drop questions both in the chat and also in the question box down at the bottom of your screen. But for those that I can't answer, I will direct to Robert directly as we're crafting together. We also have Jesse Katz-Greenberg, our artist community manager, who will be in the chat helping to moderate as well. And so you'll notice that we can't see all of your lovely faces, but we definitely want to see your projects from this class. So to do that, please snap a photo of your work either during or after today's session, share that to Instagram, and be sure to tag both Spoonflower and Robert Mahar with the hashtag Spoonflower Craft Friday, so we can drop those details in the chat as well. And finally, in order to properly kick us off, I'd love to give a formal introduction of our instructor Robert Mahar. And after I give this info, I'll drop some of his links in the chat so that you can get to know him a little bit more. But Robert Mahar is a California-based artist and educator who teaches thoughtfully researched and developed hands-on projects based in historical craft traditions. He's also a proud contestant alumni and subsequent associate producer on NBC's crafting competition show, Making It, with Amy Poehler and Nick Offerman. With an education in studio arts and art history, he's worked in a variety of creative fields, including 13 years as an appraiser of modern and contemporary art. You can learn more about Robert, explore his video tutorial archive, and shop his collection of curious embroidery samplers at his website, robertmahar.com, robert-mahar.com. Robert is a good friend of Spoonflower's, a former Spoonflower ambassador, and this is his 3rd Craft Friday event with us. I wanted to just point out, this here is actually a Robert Craft Friday project from 2 years ago that I hang every holiday season. It always brings a smile to my face when I get to pull it out of storage each year. So I'm very excited for him to share his talents with you today. You are in for a real treat. Thank you so much for being here, Robert, and I'll let you take it away.
Alexa, thank you so much. And thank you for pointing out your project in the background. I love that.
We just got to hang our first card yesterday, so.
I love it. Mine just arrived as well. And thank you for reminding me it's my 3rd Craft Friday. I couldn't remember if it was my 3rd or my 4th. So I am delighted to be back. Thank you. And hi, everybody. Happy Craft Friday. Thank you so much for being here. Whether you are joining us live in our virtual classroom here on Zoom, or if you are watching this as a recording at a later date, I just want to let you know how much I appreciate you being here to spend a little creative time with us. Craft Friday is one of my favorite programming events that Spoonflower does throughout the course of the year. I think it's a really lovely, thoughtful counterpoint to Black Friday. I am not bashing consumerism. We all have to shop. If you can find a good deal, by all means, go for it. But I will say it's nice to thoughtfully set aside a little time for some creative exploration, which is what we're going to do today. As Alexa kindly said, my name is Robert Mahar. I am an artist and educator based in Northern California. After about 30 years in Los Angeles, we relocated to a little town called Sonoma, which is about an hour and 15 minutes outside of San Francisco, up in the North Bay. I have worked in creative fields for more than 30 years, and for at least half of those, I've been developing hands-on projects that I present in a classroom format, either virtual, like we're doing today, or in person at workshop venues across the country. The subject matter that we're covering today, press botanicals, I'm incredibly excited about. This is sort of a new exploration for me. I have been working since moving up to the North Bay with the parks of Golden Gate. If you've ever been to San Francisco and visited Golden Gate Park, you know what a beautiful place it is. And I've been teaching classes at the San Francisco Botanical Garden and at the Conservatory of Flowers, which is a grand Victorian greenhouse. And we got it in our heads last year. Wouldn't it be interesting to explore a class on a favorite Victorian pastime, pressed flowers, in a grand Victorian landmark? And so a lot of the curriculum that I developed for that class, I'll be sharing with you today, but we're going to go a little bit more expansive. And so let's kind of review how we'll spend our time together today. First, if you'll permit me, I'm going to do a little history, origin of the craft. Second, we're going to construct our own herbariums, which is a flower press, a way for you to preserve botanicals from your own garden or backyard. Then we're going to look at the possibility of working with pre-pressed flowers, just because pressing your own takes a little time. It's not instantaneous. We'll then work on ways that we can arrange those pressed botanicals to create patterning that can easily be transferred and printed on Spoonflower fabric. And then, just kind of a little cherry on top of the sundae, we'll be doing some embellishing on some tea towels that I have already pre-printed with botanicals that I pressed earlier on. So I think we'll have a good time together. If you have questions, by all means, drop them into the chat. As Alexa said, she and Jesse are going to keep their eyes on that. I do not have my eyes on the chat. I have my eyes on my hands and my screen. And so if you have something specific you want to ask me, by all means, drop it in there. And these lovely ladies will pass that on to me. Now, like I said, I would love to give you a little bit of the origin of pressed flowers. If you are anxious to get to the making part and you are watching this as a recording, I'm just going to encourage you to skip ahead 10 minutes in the recording and we'll get right to the making, I promise. But as Alexa mentioned, I love a project that is based in a historical tradition, and this one does not disappoint. Press botanicals have been around for ages. In fact, there's evidence of them having been found in the tomb of Tutankhamun's mother. They've been used throughout time for ceremonial purposes, for decorative purposes, for sentimental reasons, and also for scientific study. And we're going to try and touch on a lot of that. One of the first times, though, in my reading that I found press botanicals used purely for a high craft or a fine art purpose was in Japan in the 15th century. The practice involved pressing the flowers, and then once they were pressed and dried, they were cut apart, dissected, and then rearranged and collaged into new images. These were often still lifes, more often landscapes, beautifully detailed. If you want to fall down a delightful rabbit hole, Google the word Oshibana, Oshibana. It is a beautiful art form, and really worth a little further exploration. In the 16th century, it said that samurai warriors often took Oshibana classes as a way of helping develop a higher level of patience and also to improve their dexterity. As you can imagine, it is not a fast craft, reassembling all of these pieces to create beautiful landscapes. And I kind of love that little factoid. However, if you skip ahead to the mid 1700s, we find that there's increased trade between Japan and Western countries, increase in travel, trade, and commerce. And one of the imports, of course, that came with all of the other goods were examples of Oshibana, and it was incredibly well received. In fact, it spawned a pastime craze, if you will. By the end of the 1800s, it was wildly popular. In fact, I came across a letter in my readings from Emily Dickinson to a friend that was written in 1845, and I'm going to look off screen to read it. Have you made an herbarium yet? I hope you will. If you have not, it's such a treasure to you. Almost all the girls are making one, which kind of gives you an idea of the breadth of the popularity of this. What's interesting is that this time period also overlaps with the Victorian era. Now, the reign of Queen Victoria was from 1837 to 1901. It was a time of tremendous change, some good, some horrific. And what you found was this was also the period of the Industrial Revolution. So we were switching from an agrarian society where we were focused on growing crops to an industrialized one where we're building factories and producing material goods. And along with these big changes came a really strict stratification in social order with the aristocracy, a burgeoning middle class, and then a very poor working class. And what's fascinating about this stratification is with this burgeoning middle class, it's one of the first times in history we have such a large group of people with a little bit of disposable income and a little bit of extra time. So what comes with extra income and extra time? Leisure time activities. So we see an emergence of pastimes. People are leaning into the arts. We're learning how to play music. We're learning how to play sports. We're learning how to paint. We're doing other pastimes like pressed flowers, which is wonderful. And we saw the focus on pressed flowers happen in two pretty distinct groups. On one hand, we had the scientific community. The Victorian era was a time of immense advancements in medicine and physics and biology and botany. So we find these botanists going out into the field, collecting botanical specimens, plants from the areas in which they live, putting them between pieces of blotter paper, and then putting those between pieces of wood, pressing them to preserve them, and creating records called herbariums. Oftentimes just a large bound book in which they'd take the pressed flowers, they adhere it to the inside, and then they would take all sorts of scientific notes on the Latin name, the common name, the condition, the location, and it was their way of sort of creating a natural record of the world around them. Now, on the other hand, we had the laymen, people that weren't professionals, weren't scientists pursuing this, and these were primarily ladies of leisure. I don't say that pejoratively, but if we look at this burgeoning middle class, this was a time in which not only was there a strict social hierarchy, there was a very strict gender divide. And so men were often tasked with working and providing for their family, whereas women were tasked with taking care of the home and raising children. However, if you are part of this privileged middle class, all of a sudden you've got money to hire a nanny to take care of your kids, and you can have a staff to take care of your home, and you also are able to pursue some of these pastimes. Now, granted, because of the strict social hierarchy, there are only a certain number of pastimes that are socially acceptable for women. And pressed flowers, miraculously, was amongst them. Now, oftentimes you saw these being used for decorative purposes, creating beautiful framed arrangements that would decorate your walls, or something akin to decoupage, where they would get pressed and then adhered onto furniture as a decorative motif. You also saw them used for sentimental reasons. People wanting to preserve flowers from their wedding bouquet, from a child's christening, from a funerary arrangement. In fact, there are bouquets still preserved from the grave of Abraham Lincoln, all of these 100+ years later. So it very much was a sentimental pursuit. But what I love is that there's a little bit of overlap between these two areas. Because the role of women was so limited during this time period, there wasn't always access to formal education. And if you were interested in scientific study, this was kind of one of the few ways that you could participate. So you also could go out into your yard, go out into your garden, go out into the countryside, pick specimens, press them, study them in the same way that a professional scientist might be, but they would be more for your own personal use. So in that way, it feels almost deliciously subversive in that, despite this strict gender divide, it was a way for you to kind of reach across the aisle, if you will, and participate in a quieter way. So we see all the way from Tutankhamun's mother's tomb to the walls of Victorian families to here we are today. Now, this craze that started in the Victorian era really started to wane in the early 20th century, but we've seen, a resurgence in interest sort of in a cyclical way, very popular in the 1970s. And recently, there's been a wonderful sort of resurgence in interest. If you go on TikTok, if you go on Instagram, it's really fun to see what folks are doing with pressed botanicals. I came across a delightful video the other day of this guy who was spending all of his free time going around finding white shoes in thrift stores and then collaging and decoupaging pressed flowers on the exterior of them, and they were completely charming. So there is a lot of possibility combining this old world craft with new world materials. But I think where I'd like to start today is with creating our own herbarium, our little flower press, if you will. There is a lot of flexibility in creating one of these. And I will say, most of us had an introduction to pressed flowers when we were kids. If you had a classroom like mine, we learned about pressing flowers between the pages of books. Now, granted, I'm dating myself with this statement, but I grew up in an age when phone books were still delivered to your home and they were about 3 inches thick. So it became the perfect way to press your flowers. And I'm going to show you an example of some that were pressed in a book. And to do that, I'm going to share my screen. So bear with me 1 second while I switch over to that. Now, hopefully you all should be able to see my screens now, my hands on camera, and I'm going to pull into frame a great old book that I've got in my library and just open this up to a page where I have pressed some flowers. Now, you stick them within the pages of the book, within the folds of a piece of newsprint or copy paper like I've done here. And over the course of time, that pressure really just expels all of the moisture in those plants and gets them to the point where they are just completely flat and paper-like. They're wonderful. They are very delicate, I will say. So we're going to talk a little bit about best practices for handling them so as not to crush them after having waited so long for them to be revealed. So again, a book is always a great place to start. And if you don't want to go through the process of building your own press, know that you've got this available to you. However, I want to walk you through the process of creating your own flower press. I am seated at a really long table today with a lot of materials on it. So I'm going to be doing a lot of stretching back and forth, pulling things into frame. If you look on the blog post that accompanies this tutorial that's on the Spoonflower blog, I have specified 6-inch square pieces of wood to use. You can actually create these any scale you want. I just did this because I thought it's a nice travel size. It's going to fit easily into my backpack when I'm out and about, and is a fun way to be able to kind of collect on the fly. So let's review the materials we're going to be using. One are 2 pieces of wood. These are just plywood. They're 1/4 of an inch thick. If you go into your craft supply store, inevitably there is a wood aisle with pre-cut pieces. You are likely to find some pre-cut wood panels there. Many of them you'll find will be 1/8 of an inch thick. I would recommend trying to find some that are 1/4 of an inch thick, just because we're going to be drilling holes into these, and we want them to be thick enough so that they don't easily snap or crack when we add pressure on them. I will say what we're going to do next is take a little bit of, once you've got your panels, whatever size they are, take some painter's tape, the blue painter's tape that sticks and unsticks easily. We're just going to tape these pieces together. I've done this in advance, so I'm going to talk you through the process. And then we're going to take a 1/4 inch drill bit and drill a hole in every single corner. And we're coming in about 1/4 of an inch from the exterior. If you get too close, that'll crack and splinter. We don't want that to happen. And the reason we tape the 2 pieces together is to perfectly align the holes in the 2 pieces of wood. This is going to make sure that when we screw them back together, they're all going to line up nice and neat as a pin. Now, aside from your wood panels, we're also going to be using some corrugated cardboard. This time of year, with all of the packages coming in the mail, this is a great way to recycle some of your cardboard. We want to cut these down so that they're about 1 inch smaller than our wood pieces. And cutting them down, you can see we avoid overlapping those holes, which is great. And then in addition to our corrugated pieces, we're going to be using either some newspaper or just some copy paper, cutting them down into pieces that are basically 4 by 10 inches. And the reason I do that is because I want to fold them in half, and that's going to allow me to slip some of the botanicals inside there, hold them nice and neat as we're pressing them between our layers. Now, what holds all of this together? What holds all this together is some hardware. We have got, actually, I'm going to pull this one into scale first. These are called carriage bolts. They're long, sturdy bolts. They either have a flat or a domed head. I'm using some that are 2.5 inches in length. They come much longer, and by all means, you can create or use whatever length you'd like to create a herbarium or a flower press that is thicker than this. And you'll see as we construct this what I mean by that. In addition to our 1/4 inch round carriage bolts, we're also going to be using some washers with a 1/4 inch hole in the middle. And we're also going to be using a wing nut. I love that name, wing nut. It's also a 1/4 inch hole in the center. So knowing that these are all at our disposal, we're going to go ahead and construct our flower press. I will say, just as a note, when you drill your holes into the corners, on occasion, your wood will splinter a little bit. You can see on this bottom piece of mine where some of it peeled a little bit. Don't worry about that. It's certainly not going to affect the functionality of your flower press, but you may want to consider taking some fine grained sandpaper and just spend a little time sanding over that just to avoid splintering. You don't want to get splinters while you're working on this. You'll also find perhaps some splintering in the holes that you've drilled. If you want to just do a quick pass over those holes, one way to do that is just to take a toothpick and kind of roll your sandpaper around it. That's going to create a nice little cylindrical piece of sandpaper, as I've done there, and that will allow you to go in and sort of sand the interior of those holes to get rid of any splinters. Again, just sort of an optional component to putting together your flower press, but one that you might find a little handy. So let's begin. I am going to begin by taking my carriage bolts, and I'm going to place them through the underside of my bottom wood piece. And I'm going to do it so that the heads are facing towards my work surface. it's just going to help contain a little bit of chaos as we put together these moving parts. So I've got all 4 of them in there now, sitting on my work surface. And the next thing we're going to do is create a little bit of a layer sandwich, if you will. We're going to add in 1 piece of corrugated cardboard, and then we're going to add in 1 piece of our folded blotter paper, which can be newsprint, like I said, or it can be copy paper from your home printer, either way. And we're going to continue in this way, building them up until we've got this lovely layer cake. And then we're going to top it off with the top layer of our second piece of wood. But since I've got it at this stage, I want to talk about adding in our botanicals and some general rules of thumb for pressing them. One of the things that I love about this particular craft is that they're, like so many other crafts, are enthusiast groups, guilds. And one of the ones that I've learned a lot from is the Worldwide Pressed Flower Guild. Their web address is www.pfg.org. Worldwide Pressed Flower Guild. And they talk about some best practices for pressing flowers. And momentarily, I'm going to take this off screen and bring some flowers into frame. Now, here in Northern California, we have not had a frost yet, so I still have some blooms in the garden. Not a lot to select from, but still some very pretty ones. And one of the things that the Worldwide Pressed Flower Guild recommends is that you always press flowers when they are newly opened. Like all flowers, once they have opened and are on their stems for multiple days, they continue to grow, they continue to thicken. If you press them when they're newly opened, it's when they're at their thinnest and they will press the finest. You can see with these yellow flowers here, while they're beautiful and charming, they have been on the stem for a little bit longer, so they are a little bit thicker in the petals, still though relatively thin and should press well. Another good rule of thumb is to gather small amounts of flowers at a time and just get them in the press as promptly as possible. This prevents them from wilting before you are able to get them between the pages of the blotter pieces. Another good rule of thumb is to gather around mid-morning. Why would we do that? It's because mid-morning is when the dew has had the opportunity to evaporate and the afternoon sun has not yet come out and wilted them. So it's kind of that little sweet spot. And then in the beginning, when you're just first starting out, a good idea is to concentrate on flatter flowers that you know will press more easily. Think about things like pansies or petunias, perhaps some flatter daisies that are along this line. Most thick flowers require a little bit more of advanced pressing techniques, but this is a really good starting point. And then just, my friends, keep in mind that flowers are affected by all sorts of conditions that are beyond our control. So you will find that sometimes a flower presses well one year and the next year not so much. And also remember that some flowers simply don't press well and they don't hold their color. If you think about a flower that might not necessarily press well, we can go to the extreme and talk about sunflowers. Clearly too thick, too large. It's really not going to be affected in the way you want by pressing them between our blotter paper and our boards. But like this bougainvillea, these daisies, these lighter purple flowers, these will hopefully press a little bit nicely. What I'm going to do in order to prep these for pressing is I'm just going to cut them right below the head. I am trying not to cut off too much of this portion right below the petals because that's where all the petals are connected. If I were to cut that, it really would just fall apart into some beautiful floral confetti. So I'm just going to cut a few of these so that I've got them at the ready for our flower press. And then, whoops, I'm going to do the same with my bougainvillea. Now, some plants like the bougainvillea, this could probably be flattened as an entire branch, incorporating some of the stems and the leaves. But for the purpose of this demo, I'm just going to go ahead and snip the heads off of some of these. I am so delighted by bougainvillea. It's one of those plants that grows so well here in California and comes in so many ridiculous color variations. It always makes me happy. These little guys, I am not entirely sure what they are. If you know, maybe you can drop drop that knowledge in the chat for me, but I'm just going to snip off some of these heads and set them aside. I realize that not everyone is in a climate right now where flowers are readily blooming in their yard. We haven't had our first big frost here yet, so there's still a few things available. However, you probably have some fall leaves, perhaps, which also press beautifully. Or there's also the opportunity of just picking some up at the grocery store or your local flower mart. These are all options for this season. Otherwise, this might be something that you save until the spring. Now that I have clipped those, I'm going to bring my flower press back into view, and I'm going to open up that first piece of blotter paper, and I'm just going to set a few of the flowers on the interior. One thing that I always recommend is giving a little space between them. This way that as they dry, they don't end up sticking to one another. Because that will happen as the moisture is expelled from them. They will adhere to one another if they overlap. So I'm just going to neatly fold that over the top and continue our little layer cake process here. My second piece of corrugated cardboard. And then I'm going to grab another piece of my blotter paper. I'm going to open that up, and I'm going to stick a few pieces of the bougainvillea in there. Flatten those down. And this is really, it's just a matter of trying to keep that blotter paper neatly within the confines of your corrugated cardboard. It can be a little unwieldy and wonky. We're going to secure all that in place with our screws momentarily. But let's go ahead and just place some of these in here. It also, if you happen upon a flower that has already sort of fallen apart, or you have a flower where you ended up cutting that portion underneath and it came apart as little confetti, you can dry all of those individual petals, and honestly, it'll be a nice addition to some of the compositions that you might make later on. So continuing my pile, thanks for bearing with me while I do this, just layering these up. Again, a few petals between each. Obviously, the scale of our press being what it is going to limit the size of the flowers that you can use. If you want to go a little bit bigger, by all means, you should. For these last few, I'm just going to throw these in here for the sake of finishing up the construction. So I'm not adding any into these last few, but we've got it all nice, neat, lined up. Again, all of these dimensions and materials are listed in the blog post on the Spoonflower website that will be available to you. And so now that I've got all of my flowers within the confines, I'm going to go ahead and put on that second piece of my plywood. This is just a birch plywood, again, 1/4 of an inch thick. And I'm feeding all of the little screws through the holes that I have drilled in advance. If you've drilling the holes, by the way, with a 1/4 inch bit, you can do it freestyle with just a normal home drill. If you happen to have a drill press, like a Dremel press, that's a nice, neat way to be able to put those together as well. Okay, I've got my top piece on. I'm going to go ahead and move those flowers out of the way, and I'm going to bring back in to frame my hardware. We're going to start by putting our little washers now over the top of each of our screws, one of those over each corner. And then over top of those, we're going to add our wing nuts. I love these guys. You set them down so that the little wings go up. This is your bottom surface that will be flush against the washer. So we're going to put that on there, and we're just going to start to screw those into place. I'm going to start each one, just getting it on there a little bit, and then go on to the next.
Robert, as you are applying your wing nuts,
Yeah.
I have a couple questions I'm going to bubble up to you from chat. So
Yes, please.
Susan asked, with regards to pressing in a book,
Yeah.
does it ever stain the book pages? And my assumption would be that's what the blotter paper is for.
Well, this is an excellent question. Thank you, Susan. One of the things that I always recommend is using a book that is not precious or sentimental to you. This is a good opportunity to go to the library book sale, get a big volume that you don't mind perhaps the pages getting a little warped. Even with the blotter paper, which will absorb most of the moisture, occasionally some of it will expand beyond that into the pages of the book and wrinkle them a little bit. So again, we're not going to be doing this with the family album or anything along those lines. But if you get like an old encyclopedia from a book sale, that is a perfect thing to use for this.
That's awesome, Robert. And then one more question for you, Sarah
Yeah.
Beth asks, what is the best way to preserve color? Which is a great question.
You know, this is a little challenging in that we're dealing with nature. And there's always a little bit of an organic surprise during the process. And part of this is really just a matter of experimentation. I wish there were a hard and fast rule, but honestly, there are just some colors where the pigmentation will fade during the drying process, and others where it remains a little bit more vivid and clear. I have often found that red flowers tend to fade a little bit into a pink, and blue flowers will often lose a little bit of that pigmentation as well. So, you know, and as I mentioned, some of those sort of best practices from the Worldwide Press Flower Guild, they mentioned that, you know, some flowers are going to press beautifully one year and the next year not so much. It's just a little Mother Nature mystery that we kind of have to roll with. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Robert.
You're welcome. All right, my friends, you can see that I have got the wing nuts on here now, and I've tightened them up. You can kind of see this is our side view of our little press sandwich here. You can press these down pretty much as tightly as you want. We don't want to warp it so much that we're going to risk cracking the wood, but you want to get a nice good press on it. And that's why these wing nuts come in so handily, because they've got the two little wings on the side that you can use to rotate them around the screw shaft without having to use a tool. And then, my friends, comes the waiting game. This is no one's favorite part, but what I generally recommend, once you have filled your flower press, set it on a shelf in a nice dry area. Forget about it, but put a reminder on your calendar. I would recommend coming back in a week or two. At that point in time, you can loosen up the wing nuts, check their progress. If they feel at all damp or tacky, you know that they need to spend a little bit more time in here to get to the point where we want them to be. And the end goal really is to have them thin, dry, and almost paper-like. So in order to explore that step, I am going to pull into frame another little tray with a separate flower press that I created about 2.5 weeks ago and filled with some flowers from my yard. And so we're going to take a little look and see what's going on with them. I've already removed the hardware, so I've taken off the washers and the wing nuts. I'm going to take off that top piece of wood here. Take off my top piece. And then we're going to have a little show and tell and see. Oh, those turned out well. Now, this is interesting. These flowers were a bright fuchsia when I put them in, and now they're almost like a deep rusty rose color, which is really lovely. As I touch these gently, they're still a little bit pliable, but they feel pretty dry. And I love how the leaves around the base of the petals have dried in this beautiful sort of crown-like configuration. As you're putting flowers into the press, you will want to think about what configuration you're laying them down in. It's often hard, unless you have a very flat flower, to have it facing you, facing up on your paper. It is easiest often just to put them on their side. But I love those. All right, let's see what's next. out a little piece of foliage. We've got a beautiful old fig tree in our yard. Here is a live leaf that I just picked this morning. This was a smaller one that dried this morning. I would say as I'm feeling these between my hands, they really are pretty dry. This is 2.5 weeks out, as I mentioned. I may actually, though, keep them in the press for another week or so, just so they get really, really dry to the point of almost being brittle. Let's see what's here. Oh, those are pretty. Look at that. Little azalea pieces from our yard. Now, sometimes you'll find that they stick to the paper a little bit. You just want to be a little bit gentle. I recommend getting a good pair of tweezers, and I'll often pick them up at the base where all the flowers connect, or if this were on a stem, I'd pick it up by the stem. That came off pretty well. And you can see these have all maintained their color fairly well. I will say once they are out of the press and displayed, if you choose to say mount these, frame them, put them on your wall, um, like a lot of artwork, they will fade over time if they're exposed to direct sunlight. So always a good idea to kind of keep them in a room where they're not exposed directly to a window. I'm gonna go ahead and close that guy up, see what's next. These
Robert,
are like,
Annie asks a great question. She says,
yeah.
can you over dry the flowers? Like if you forget about them for a couple of months, would it ruin them?
Absolutely not. In fact, you could leave it there for a year and open them up and they would be perfectly fine. Um, because we've expelled the moisture, it's sort of a preservation technique. And so, no way to over dry them. Great question. Here's those little purple guys that I had put between the pages earlier. Here's one where it's on the stem still. I love that. This one seems to have stuck just a tiny bit. It just, you just have to move slowly, be a little gentle with it. Like I said, trying to pick it up by the stem or the base of the flower is going to be your best bet. Because oftentimes, if I were to say pick this up by the petal, it would likely rip or crack depending on how dry it is. I'm really pleased with how these turned out. And that purple is really nice and vibrant. I love that. Okay, next one. I think this, oh, yep, just a little bit of foliage. I think as you are pressing flowers, if you're thinking about creating designs with them, it's always nice to have a good mix of both florals and foliage. You want some of these stems and these leaves as part of your composition. They pair so nicely together, but they will need to be dried separately most often. And then last one, I don't remember what's down here. Let's see. Here's some of those little yellow flowers. And you can see these were the daisies, little daisies that looked like this. They pressed flat on their side because of the stamen in the center. You can try and position them face up, but it's a little bit more challenging. But look how pretty they dried on their side. Now these, well, there definitely is some sticking. It came off fairly nicely. You can see there's a little bit of loss there on the blotter paper, but not too much. I think they came out really nice. Sometimes they'll stick, so we're just going to move gently, if you will. There we go. Now, can you reuse your blotter paper? If it feels like it has dried enough and is not too incredibly warped or marked up with the remains of some of the flowers you pressed, by all means, absolutely reuse it. As I mentioned earlier, this is just copy paper from my home printer. You could also recycle newsprint, and that's going to work perfectly well. Once they are out of the press, you can store them in envelopes. You don't want to crowd them too much because you want them to keep flat, and you always want to store them flat versus taking the envelope and storing it on its side. So my friends, that's kind of our general process with putting together the flower press, our own little herbarium. If you have any questions about this particular process, this is a great time to ask while I kind of pile this back up, and then we're going to jump into how to translate these into some patterning for Spoonflower fabric.
Robert,
set
we
that.
do have one other question
Yeah, please.
from Sarah Beth again, who says, have you ever tried to preserve flowers with silica gel? I've seen it done on YouTube, but I've never tried it.
I have not tried it, but I've also watched those videos and they're fascinating. Silica gel, if you're not familiar, almost looks a little bit like sand. And folks will take like a little Tupperware container, a little plastic container, they'll fill it with the silica gel, they'll bury the flowers in it, and that silica gel draws all of the moisture out of them. It's a great method if you're going to be working with three-dimensional arrangements. Say you wanted to preserve your wedding bouquet and then get a shadow box to recreate that bouquet in 3D. That's a really good way to do it. However, for the purpose of creating the patterns that we're going to do today, flattened flowers usually work best. Make sense? Okay.
Robert. And then one more question. Abby says,
Yes,
can you
please.
repeat again the best way to store them?
Sure. There are a couple of ways you can go about it. You can leave it in your flower press for as long as you want. However, if you are ready to reuse your flower press for a new batch of botanicals, you can take them out and you could even keep them in the folds of the blotter paper and then just tuck these into a larger envelope. That way they're sort of contained nicely. They're not being in the envelope. They don't run the risk of sliding out and falling all over the place because they are delicate. Once something like this falls onto the floor, it becomes a little bit of a challenge to get down there and try and tweezer it off your floor. So I would recommend perhaps keeping them in the blotter paper and sticking them into an envelope, or they can just go into the envelope on their own as well. Okay, so let me move this aside. I want to talk for a minute about what to do if you're ready to get going with this project, but you don't have the 2 to 3 weeks to wait for your flowers to dry. Or, like I mentioned, you perhaps live in a climate where you don't have access to flowers at the moment, and you really want to get on a holiday project. There are online venues that sell pre-pressed flowers, which is kind of a magical and fun thing to look through. In the blog post, I have included a link to the website that I use. That's one called greetingsofgrace.com. I think that they do such a nice job. Each of these packets has about 20 pieces in them, and they somehow have managed to seal them into these beautiful little flat packets with some cardboard backing for stability so that in transit, they're not going to get crumpled. And then when I am ready to open them up, I'm going to do one here just by way of example. They've got little notches in the plastic so that you can just sort of, almost as if you were opening up a chip bag. You can zip that open. Oops, there we go. And then you can pull out the inner portion, and there is a little plastic piece that kind of keeps them nice and neat. How they line these up so beautifully, neat as a pin, and get them pressed, I honestly do not know. Let me grab my tweezers 1 second. Here we go. But what's so nice about having this accessible is the world is now your oyster as far as the variety of botanicals that you can use and the colorations. You might have a garden that has a lot of yellow and orange flowers, but no sort of purple and blue, and you want to use those in a design. This is a quick and easy way to access them. These are incredibly dry, and so you just want to be a little gentle in your handling of them. Again, picking them up with the stem, using your tweezers, you flip it over to the back side, and you can see that the back side is a little bit paler, the front side a little bit brighter on those. Oops, those separate, which is lovely. They also have foliage variations, which is really fun. Ferns are such a nice thing to use in the inclusion of sort of some of your press botanical patterning. So it's a nice thing to think about using. And again, flowers that perhaps you don't grow in your garden. I love these pansies so much. I think they're really charming. This particular website gives you the option of just getting the flower heads or getting some on the stems. And so that's something to think about as well. It's nice to get a variety. And there are variety packs as well, where they've got different variations on a color theme, but different species of flowers, some on the stem with the addition of some greenery. So I love that these are available to us. And now that we've got some pressed flowers, what do we do with them? How do we create patterning with them that would translate nicely, especially in the context of thinking about having them printed on some Spoonflower fabric? So let me talk you first through some possible ways to arrange them for patterning. And then we'll talk about some of the technical aspects of transferring those patterns onto the Spoonflower website. So I'm going to set these aside, and I'm going to pull into frame some examples that I have already created of some pressed botanical compositions. When you are doing this, especially with the idea in mind of creating a pattern to print on Spoonflower fabric, I recommend just getting a nice clean piece of white paper as your base. I'm going to pull some into frame that they're a little bit off-white, but they will work nicely as well. Here's a nice example. We've got some foliage in the background. We've got a couple of the pansies on top, some rose leaves, some little lupin flower heads on there. When you've got two options, basically, when you go to create a pattern. One is to secure all of your foliage and flowers onto the piece of paper. And the way that we would do that is simply by applying a little bit of glue to the back of them before we place them on our paper. I would do this by picking it up very gently with my fingers and my tweezers. I would take a little bit of white glue on a toothpick and just dab it gently at regular intervals along the back. You do not have to cover the entire back of the pressed botanical. You really just need to dot it. And so I would probably put 3 or 4 dots on the stem, a couple on some of the outer leaves, and a couple along this little crown of flowers at the top. And then use your tweezers to help you place it gently. You'll lay it down and then just kind of tap it in place with your fingers to secure it. And that's exactly what I did for this composition here. The other way to go about it is simply to take your plain white piece of paper, lay them out in whatever configuration you would like. Perhaps you just want a little field of these flowers in an irregular pattern, and we'll be able to capture the image here as well. I'm going to get into capturing the image in a moment, but I just bring this up to point out that you can either glue them down on your work surface if you know this composition is something that you want to hang on to, or if you really just want to capture the image of the flowers to be manipulated in a photo processing program, you can keep them loose and we'll photograph them here. And I'll come back to that in just a second. But I want to continue showing you a couple of other examples of configurations. Here's one simple wreath format, circular format. This is one where it's always a good idea if you're dealing with different thicknesses. The flowers are a little bit thicker than our foliage. It's nice to lay that foliage down first, kind of build it up in layers, and then add perhaps the more fibrous or stemmy pieces on top of that. There's also the possibility of using these to frame some photographs. I love this idea. And I think even if you were to transfer this image onto a tea towel, how sentimental and lovely. You know, perhaps this is your grandmother or your mother when she was younger. To kind of have some of that imagery on a textile, I think is a really charming idea. To do this, I simply secured down first the flat foliage, the flowers went on top of that. And then to secure the photograph in place, I don't want to glue my photograph down because this is something that's going to go back in the photo album. So to do this, I just used removable adhesive glue dots. Those are the little dots. You'll find them in a roll at the craft supply store. You put one on the back corner of your photograph, press it down into place. it will remain there as long as you want it to, but when you're ready to remove it, you can simply peel it up and that adhesive will release on the back without damaging the photograph. So those are a nice thing to know about. Another option is a little bit more of an all-over motif, which is kind of fun. Gives you a little bit more of a full composition and keeps the flowers separate versus creating kind of a bouquet configuration as I did here. And then one other possibility just to throw into the mix is doing a monogram. I love the idea of a monogram. We've seen monogram bath towels. Why not a floral monogram tea towel? To do this, I had 2 pieces of paper side by side. On one of them, I took a pencil and it just lightly sketched out the S. And then I laid down my florals on top of that just to kind of see what placement I might want to use. And then I slowly transferred them from one piece of paper to the next, gluing them down on the second sheet. Does that make sense? I kind of kept them loose on one to be able to manipulate them, figure out my configuration, and then slowly, painstakingly, if you will, went back and forth and glued them into position here to create my little beautiful S monogram. Now that we've kind of explored a couple of ways to manipulate our flowers on the surface, let's talk about capturing them in a digital way so that they can be transferred to the Spoonflower website. There are 2 good options I see, and I've outlined these in the blog post. One is just to snap a photograph, lay flat style with your camera. And now when I say lay flat, I'm basically taking my camera, I'm flipping it over so that it's parallel with my photograph, I'm holding it up above, and I'm taking a photograph of the image overhead. That's the simplest way, I think, to go about it. The second way that I also detail on the blog post is scanning them. If you've got a home printer, laying down your botanicals on the bed of your scanner. If we pretend that my phone here is my scanner bed, and then I take one of my pressed flowers and I put it on top of the scanner bed. Once I've laid them all out, I'm going to take a plain piece of white paper, lay that down over the top, and then I'll shut the top door of the scanner, and I'm going to scan it at a nice high resolution. One of the interesting things about scanning your photographs is because of the bright light that runs in your scanner. If you've ever done a scanner, you know it starts at one side and zips back and forth across it. That bright light penetrates sort of the thin foliage and flowers and kind of adds a little bit of a brightness to them, which I think is really charming and interesting. Either way, capturing it with your phone or by the scan gives you then a digital image. Now, what do we do with that digital image? I'm not going to get into too many of the technical details of using a photo processing program, but I tend to work in Photoshop. I've worked with it for a long time, and I realized that not everybody has that piece of software on their computer, but know that there are alternatives that are free. There are free versions of PicMonkey is a great one, or Canva. Both allow you to manipulate an image. And some things to think about in the process of capturing your images and how they'll translate into a photo editing program. If you use an image like this, where you've got all of your flowers separate from one another, there's not really a lot of overlap, you either photograph this with your camera or you scan it with your scanner. Once you then get this image into your photo editing process, you can digitally separate them from one another and move them into whatever configuration you want, which I think gives you a lot of flexibility. And that's something that I did with the tea towels that I created, and I'll show you those in just a few minutes. But it also gives you the possibility of enlarging some of them, playing with scale, which is sort of fun. These are all as they appeared in nature. But in the photo editing program, if you wanted to, you could take this little pansy head and you could blow it up to 2 or 3 times its size and overlap it with some of the other florals and foliage to create some fun designs that you wouldn't necessarily see in nature, but you're taking the natural elements and just manipulating them some. Another thing to think about is if you've created sort of a composition like this little wreath format or this little bouquet format, this can stand as a standalone design. Once you photograph these or scan them and upload them to the Spoonflower website, the Spoonflower website, the interface does give you the ability to do a repeat pattern. So say I just uploaded this particular image and I want it repeated in a tiled format or a brick format. Spoonflower's website will allow you to do that without having to use a photo processing program. Now, any questions? I know that was a very quick overview on some of the technical aspects. And I will again mention that in the blog tutorial, there are some links to some previous blog posts on the Spoonflower blog that talk a little bit more in detail about things like resolution and scaling and using some of these photo software editing programs in order to upload to the Spoonflower website. But hopefully that kind of gives you some general ideas, at least of your options. Alexa, any questions from our friends in the room?
Robert, thank you. That's great. And I know that those resources are going to be so helpful, especially for the technical aspect of utilizing our platform for that purpose. I'm going to backtrack just a little bit because we did have a question about the glue that we should use for the flowers.
Absolutely. I use Eileen's white tacky glue. Honestly, any white glue is going to be fine. You could use Elmer's like you did as a kid. Any of those white glues that dry clear are perfect for the purpose. I have some friends that work in botanicals and they tend to prefer using a wood glue. I haven't necessarily found an advantage to the wood glue over top of using just a plain white glue. Both of them will dry clear. You just want to be really sparse in the application of the glue onto the back of your florals before you press them down into place.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, my friends, we have covered now a little bit of the history of our press botanicals. We've talked about putting together our own flower press or our own herbarium. We've talked about some ways to arrange them on a page, either securing them in place with glue or leaving them loose and then either photographing them with our phone or putting them into a scanner to capture that image, uploading them if you want to a photo editing software such as PicMonkey, Canva, or Photoshop, and then uploading those to the Spoonflower website. One thing that I will add is that, and I'll show you an example of this, when I created my image, what I decided to do in Photoshop was to lay out, bear with me one second. I mentioned that I'm sitting at a very large table with all of my materials. And I'm doing my best not to get them all mixed up. I'm going to pull into frame now my fabric. I had such a good time with these. These are some examples of the tea towels that I created. And you can see here what I meant by playing around with scale in the photo editing process. These pansies were probably maybe 2/3 this scale, so I made them a little bit larger. The photo editing software also allows you to play with the brightness and the contrast. I was able to lighten these up a little bit and heighten some of the color on them. And rather than doing a repeat pattern on mine where I had, say, the same image, I had mentioned like this one in particular, I could have used this to create just sort of a grid pattern across my fabric. Instead, what I did in Photoshop is I created a document that was the same size as a fat quarter of the linen cotton canvas. I am a big fan of linen cotton canvas. I use it in a lot of my work. It's got a really nice hand feel to it. For tea towels, it washes and softens beautifully. And it also really works well with the embroidery, which we'll get to in just a second. But I wanted to show you, I laid out that entire tea towel as one single document. And what that allowed me to do is make it appear as though the florals were blooming up from either end of my tea towel and kind of blooming across the surface, which I thought was kind of a fun and charming way to deal with that rather than having an all over repeat pattern. You've got two options when you're ordering your fabric from Spoonflower. You can just order the unfinished fat quarter that is unfinished along the edges. If you've got a sewing machine at home and are comfortable with doing hemming on this, that is a great option for you and will save you a little bit. But if you don't want to have to go to the trouble, or you don't have the equipment to do the hemming, you can order them ready-made from Spoonflower, where they do a beautiful job hemming those edges for you. And they also include the little hanging loop in one of the corners, so you can hang your tea towel up for use in your kitchen, which I think is such a nice thing to do. I am going to pull back into frame my unfinished piece of this. And for my color palette, I kind of really leaned into a lot of the purples, the greens, with some accents of yellow on here. I'll flip it over so you can see the other side as well. Again, playing with scale on some of these, making some larger than others. And if you remember, I had mentioned that if you had some petals that fell off during the drying process, scan them anyways. Look how cute they are. They kind of, feel as though a wind gust came across and some of them fell off and are blowing across my tea towel. I kind of like that option as a design motif. Now, if you have followed my work for any length of time, I am hard pressed not to embellish any of my Spoonflower fabric with embroidery. I think it adds such a charming little amount of color and texture to your work. But I will say, if you're doing some embroidery on a tea towel, one thing to keep in mind is this is something that we're hopefully using on a regular basis, and it's going into the washing machine. So I'm going to go really light on the embroidery just so that I'm not dealing with an excessive amount of knots on the back of my fabric. Because of our limited time together, I'm not doing a full embroidery tutorial, but I am going to show you two particular stitches that I think are super versatile and could work well in the process of embellishing some of your flowers. Old school embroidery patterns, if you are familiar and have embroidered before, they almost looked like a coloring book, like an outline drawing, and you would just stitch along those lines. One of the ways in which Spoonflower has kind of transformed my embroidery is it's allowed me to upload images like this, have them printed on a beautiful textile, and then really have a choose your own adventure session of embroidery where I can now go in and I can stitch along any of these lines that I want to create a little texture. I can add a little French knot center to them. I can add some colors that don't exist here. Say, I'm using this in my kitchen, but I also have beautiful teal accents in my kitchen. I could go in and add some teal lines into my florals, creating something that doesn't necessarily exist in nature, but is a way for me to kind of manipulate it and also coordinate it then with the rest of the interior of the room that I want these to live in, which is my kitchen. So I want to show you first the back stitch. The back stitch is one of those beautiful core embroidery stitches that creates just a beautiful straight line. And what I'm pulling into frame here is this is a 6-inch embroidery hoop. I have sandwiched in there a piece of polka dot fabric. I have taught embroidery on polka dot fabric for many years because it's a nice sort of visual way to learn a stitch. It's almost a connect the dots fashion. So you're stitching from one dot to the next. So as you're learning, it's a nice way to do that. I used to go try and find some Swiss dot fabric in the ready-made fabric store. Couldn't find exactly the right scale that I wanted, so I ended up creating my own on Spoonflower. This is something that actually lives in my Spoonflower shop. I refer to it as embroidery practice grid fabric. All of the spaces in my grid are about 1/4 of an inch apart, which is also a nice way for you to practice your stitch length. While your stitch length will vary some on your actual embroidery, 1/4 of an inch is kind of a good standard length to aim for. And then I'm going to be working today with some 6-strand embroidery floss. 6-strand embroidery floss comes on a beautiful little skein. You've got so many colors to choose from when you go to your craft supply store. It's called 6-strand embroidery floss because if you separate it, it's actually 6 individual threads that are combined together to create this. And what's so fun about that is that you can actually separate those strands and stitch. Instead of all 6, you could stitch with just 3 and create a thinner line instead of a thicker line. In addition to our floss, you're going to need an embroidery needle. Embroidery needles come in a wide variety of sizes, typically from 2 to 12. Counterintuitively, the smaller the number of the needle, the larger it is. I'm working with a number 3 needle today. And then it's always nice to have a little pair of sharp embroidery snips. As I mentioned, your embroidery floss comes on a beautiful little skein like this. If you're using, most brands have 2 paper bands that are holding that together. The end that's got the little barcode is the easiest end to pull from. It's going to cause a little less tangling. And I typically will pull out a length that goes, I'm going to hold this up off camera if you're looking at my face, from my fingertips to my elbows. That gives me a length that's about 12 to 16 inches in length. I'm just going to give that a little snip with my embroidery snips. And then I'm going to separate these strands into 3 and 3. It's going to give me a little bit of a thinner line because I'm going to be stitching along some of the lines in my tea towel, and those lines are the stems of the flower, and they tend to be really thin. And so I want to try and match that thickness. So I'm going to take the eye end of my needle, and I'm going to, over the tip of my finger, I'm going to try and separate it 3 and 3. It's a little bit of a finicky process, but that's why we use the blunt end of our needle as a tool. Once you've separated the end, you can kind of hold it in one hand in almost a Y configuration, like I'm doing here, and then just take your index finger on your opposing hand and just gently run it down the center. You want to do this really slowly so they don't tangle, but that's going to separate them into 2 sets of 3. I'm going to set one of those aside, and then this piece I'm going to use to do my stitching. On one end of it, I'm just going to create a little knot. And then I'm actually going to double that knot just to make it nice and thick so it doesn't pull through my fabric. We're going to be knotting all of our embroidery today because we know that these tea towels are going to be placed in the washing machine. And if I just woven it amongst some stitches on the back, which is another common embroidery method of ending your embroidery stitch line, those could potentially come loose. So a nice knot is going to save us from that. The other end, we're going to thread through the eye of our needle. And to do that, I'm just going to give it a nice little snip. So all those strands are all an even length. I'm going to take my needle and I am going to wet the end of this strand on the tip of my tongue just a little bit, and then I'm going to press them all together so those strands stick together. If you hold it just between your thumb and your forefinger and bring the eye of your needle towards you, it's usually a pretty good way of getting it through the eye of the needle. Threading the needle is no one's favorite part of embroidery. It's going to take a little bit of practice. Know that if you're having trouble with it, you can get a needle threader. It's a common tool that you'll find in the notions aisle at your craft supply store. So just know that that's available to you. Now, we're just going to quickly now practice our back stitch. Some of you may already be familiar with this. I am going to visualize a line here along my polka dot practice fabric, and I'm going to come up through this polka dot in the back. We always start our embroidery from the back side of our fabric. We pull that through until our knot catches nice and neat on the back side, and then I'm going to stitch one polka dot length ahead. Now, my stitch line is going to go this way, so I'm just going to enter through that polka dot, pull that through, and that creates our very first stitch. Now to continue, I'm going to come up through the next polka dot in the direction of my stitch line, poke that through there. And now, as the name implies, the back stitch, there's a portion of this that is stitched backwards. So instead of continuing forward, I'm now going to stitch back to meet the end of that very first stitch. And in doing so, it begins to create the illusion of a continuous line. So I'm now going to go to the next line in the direction of my stitch line, or the next polka dot rather, poke it through there, again, stitch back to the end of my previous stitch. And we're going to continue in this fashion. I will say that it's nice to have some practice fabric because, you know, especially if you are new to embroidery, this is your opportunity to make some mistakes, to do some horrible stitching and to rip it out again. One of the beautiful things about embroidery is that if you do make a mistake or create some stitches that you don't like, it's like having a magic eraser. You can rip out those stitches and start again, and it's no harm, no foul. It's not like you're going to leave behind big gaping holes in your fabric. One of the things I will say that is one of my favorite things about stitching on Spoonflower's linen cotton canvas is every time the needle pierces through, you get that beautiful little popping noise. I don't know if you can hear that, but it's some real good crafty ASMR. The back stitch is great for stitching along stem lines. You can stitch along the center of leaves to create a spine. If, say, you wanted to create some text stitching on your embroidery, the back stitch is a great way to do that. In fact, I've got another blog tutorial on the Spoonflower website specifically dedicated to creating typography. So say you had your beautiful floral image, but then wanted to create some words in between your flowers. That would kind of guide you through doing that. And we can include that in some of the links that Jesse and Alexa provide for you. All right, I am just about to the end of my little stitch line. In fact, my needle came off, so that's probably a good place to stop with that. But let me show you how to finish this off on the back. I flipped this over, so you're seeing the back side of my hoop now. My needle has come off. I'm going to take my snips and I'm going to cut a tail that's about 4 or 5 inches in length. And then I'm going to take again the blunt end or the eye end of my needle, and I'm just going to separate the strands on this tail on the back. Because we were working with 3 strands, I've got 2 strands in one hand and 1 in the other. I pull them apart in sort of this little V formation, and then I'm just going to tie them together. I'm going to create a little knot that as I pull on those ends is going to travel down to the back of my fabric and be nice and secure. And then just for safety's sake, I'm going to double knot it. And my stitching is now nice and secure. And then I'm going to take my embroidery snips and I'm just going to snip it about 1/4 of an inch from the back, just to keep it nice and neat looking. And that's what the back stitch looks like. Now, let me jump over to an example on my Spoonflower fabric. I'm going to zoom in for a second just so you can see this a little bit better and refocus there. Bear with me. There we go. And you can see that I have just started to stitch up the stem line of one of these pansies. I think it just adds this really nice textural moment on your tea towel. And one other thing that you might want to consider if you are working with foliage in particular, variegated embroidery floss is a really nice thing. Now, this started out as a skein that looked just like this, but I ended up taking the little paper bands off and wrapping it around a little plastic bobbin. It's just another way to store your embroidery floss. But the thing that's so cool about variegated floss is that the color variation changes every so many inches along the length of it. So as you're stitching, it goes from a little bit darker to a little bit lighter to a little bit darker. And it sort of mimics some of the natural hue variations that you see in nature. So as you see, I've got it on here. I don't have my polka dots as a guide this time, but I'm just trying to do my best to eye about 1/4 of an inch to create my stitches. And I'm going to stitch that all along my stitch or my stem line there to kind of reinforce that visually. And honestly, friends, don't worry about your stitches being perfectly the same size, because we're stitching over top of a beautiful image, your pre-pressed botanicals. It covers up a multitude of sins, meaning that you're not going to necessarily see if some of my stitches are a little bit longer or a little bit shorter because you're so focused on the pretty image. It's kind of a nice little visual trick. So anyways, I am going to finish up that stem line there. And then I want to talk to you about one more stitch before we wrap it up. You all have been so patient working through this multi-step project with me. I now want to come in and I want to add a couple of French knots to the center of my flower. If you're familiar with French knots, it is literally a beautiful, teeny tiny little knot that sits up on the surface of your fabric and adds a beautiful textural element. And using them in the center of the flower kind of mimics what a flower actually looks like in real life. So to do that, I'm going to set this aside for a moment. I'm going to pull my practice fabric back into view. And now I'm going to pull out some yellow floss. Again, I'm pulling it from the barcode end of my skein. I'm doing about 12 to 16 inches in length. I'm going to give that a nice little snip. I'm going to use all 6 strands of the floss this time, and I'm going to go ahead and knot the end of it. Because I'm using all 6 strands, I don't necessarily need to double knot this. It's creating a knot that's thick enough that that's not going to pull through the fabric. And then I'm going to go to the other end, and as we did before, I'm going to give it a little snip to make sure that those ends are all about the same length. I'm again just going to wet this quickly on the tip of my tongue. That allows me to kind of press those strands together. 6 strands obviously is a little bit more challenging to thread through the eye of a needle than 3 strands. And this might be a point where you want to employ the use of a needle threader. I'm going to see if I can do this on camera. My friends, I have recently graduated to progressive lenses, which basically means I do a lot of embroidery right in front of my face, and it goes a little something like this. The glasses go up on top of my head. I wet the end of my floss. I hold it right in front of my nose to thread those through, and it works like a charm. I just can't do it 12 inches away from my face, so welcome to aging. Now, let's look at the French knot. This one is a little bit more technique heavy. I'm going to kind of reposition there. I'm just going to pick a random polka dot, and I'm going to come up through the back side of it. I'm going to pull my floss through as we did before until my knot catches on the back. And then I'm going to set my hoop down on my work surface. I'm right-handed, so I'm holding my needle in my right hand. With my left hand, I'm going to pull the floss that is coming up through the surface. Whenever your floss is on top of your fabric, it's referred to as your working thread. So I'm not pulling it hard. I'm just creating a straight line. I'm turning my needle on its side, and I'm going to come towards myself, and I'm going to wrap it 3 times. This becomes sort of a little bit of an ambidextrous dance between your 2 hands, but this is how it goes. I come towards myself, I wrap it once, twice, 3 times. I'm still going to hold on with my left hand, but I'm going to reposition the tip of my needle right next to where I came up, and I'm going to pierce the fabric. You don't want to go in the same hole because that'll just make your knot fall right through your fabric. And before I let go with my left hand, I'm going to pull that knot down the shaft of the needle to the surface of my fabric. And then I'm going to push my needle all the way through, give it a good little tug. And what you end up with then is that beautiful little knot on the surface of your fabric. Let's do it one more time, because I know I did that rather quickly. I did include in the blog tutorial a link to a video that covers this as well. So if you miss it or you want to see it in a little bit more detail, that's going to be a good resource for you. So again, I've come up through one of the dots. I've laid my hoop on my work surface with my non-dominant hand, my left hand. I'm creating this straight line from my fingertips down to the surface of my work. And then I'm going to turn my needle on its side. I'm going to come towards myself and I'm going to wrap it once, twice, 3 times. And then I'll reposition that tip of the needle right next to where I came out. I'm going to pierce the fabric. With my left hand, I'm going to pull that knot down to the surface. And then I'm going to poke this all the way through. Good, right? I think they're lovely. They take a little bit of practice. But honestly, if you're doing them in the center of the flower and you're doing a little cluster of them, if they're not all the same size, it doesn't matter. It just makes it look a little bit more organic and a little bit more like a flower should. Now that I've demoed these to you on the practice fabric, I'm going to show you what that looks like on my pressed botanical fabric. So I am going to ready my floss. I'm just reusing what I just worked with, but I am going to re-knot it again on the back just to get that nice and secure. And then I'm going to do some French knots right in the center of that little pressed botanical pansy there. So I'll come up at any point I see fit through the middle of that flower, set my hoop on my work surface, create a straight line with my non-dominant hand, come towards myself and wrap it once, twice, 3 times, reposition that tip of the needle next to where I came out, pierce it, pull the knot down to the surface, and then pull that all the way through. Sometimes it might take a little bit of muscle to pull that through, but you can see we ended up with a really sweet French knot there. And if we do a couple of these to create a little cluster of them, it gives this great sort of mimicry of what actually happens in the center of a botanical flower. Whoops, I have suddenly got myself stuck. You know what I did? Because I've got this folded up on my work surface, I've actually sewn through 2 pieces of fabric, which has created a little bit of a mess. This is a good teaching moment because I mentioned before, anytime that you screw up with this, you can always cut that out and start again. It is like having a magic eraser. And I can just go to my backside there. I can see where it kind of like got stuck and pull that out again. There we go. Did you see what happened there? It just kind of tangled up on itself on the back. Not a big deal, but it does require me to rethread my needle. So again, glasses on the head. I'm going to wet the end of it there, press those fibers together, and then I'm going to thread it through the eye of my needle. Hopefully, come on, crafting gods, we can do it. I actually think I need to give it a little bit of a haircut to make sure that it's nice and neat.
Robert, while you're doing that,
Yes,
Julie's question.
please ask me a question.
Great to ask you right now. Julie says, does the size of the needle's eye correspond to the needle size, i.e. bigger needle, bigger eye?
Yes, the larger the needle, both the shaft of the needle will be longer and larger, and the eye of the needle will also be larger. So as I mentioned, I'm working with a size 3 needle, which is kind of my go-to. But if I wanted it just to be a little bit larger and have a little bit larger eye, I would probably jump down to a number 2 size. That's a great question. Okay, I think we're back in business, my friends, with my second French knot. Our first French knot is standing proud there. And again, I've come through next to it. I am putting my hoop on my work surface, wrapping it 3 times, re-entering the fabric, pulling that knot down to the surface, and then pushing it through the backside. French knots are great. They are honestly one of my favorites. They were a little intimidating to me at first, just because it seems a little complicated. That technique of setting it on the table and holding the working thread off to the side. But once you get the hang of it, my hope is that you'll love it and you'll cover all of your work in French knots, because that's what I tend to do most days now. I'm going to do one more just to kind of finish off my little trio of French knots in the center of this pansy here. Pull that through the back. And then with the French knots, we're going to finish them off in the exact same way that we did our back stitch, where I flip it over, I cut a tail that's maybe about 4 inches, 3-4 inches in length. I take the blunt eye end of my needle and I'm going to separate those strands into 2 sets of 3. There we go. We're working with all 6 strands now. So we've got 3 in this hand and 3 in this hand. I create that little V formation, and then I'm just going to tie them together. Again, creating a knot that, as I pull, slides down to the fabric surface on the back. There we go. I'm going to double knot it just for safety's sake, and then I give it a little trim about 1/4 of an inch from the back. And by doing that, by knotting it, like I said, at the beginning and at the end, what that does is secures it so that when it goes through the wash and is in the agitator, none of those stitches are going to come out. So you can see I added a little French knot center. We did a little back stitch along the stem there. But these 2 stitches, my friends, can take you anywhere you want to go. If you want to jump over to, say, some of these lavender, you could do little French knots at the ends of each of the little individual flowers and stem stitch along the center. With some of these larger pansies, where I went into Photoshop and I created them a little bit bigger, this is an opportunity, if I wanted to do a larger cluster of the French knot in the middle. And then if I wanted to add in an additional color, maybe I do some back stitching out from the center, almost in a radial pattern. If you think of it like a bicycle wheel, adding in a different hue that didn't exist here in the past. And again, as I mentioned before, I always love the idea of adding in some text. So if you even, say you're doing a tea towel as a gift for your mom, for the holiday season, maybe you write in, stitch in 2023 on there, just so that she knows that was the year that you gifted this to her. A world of possibilities. It is an optional step. I know that our focus today really was on creating the botanical images, pressing them, and creating the tea towels. But as I mentioned, embroidery has a soft spot in my heart, and I always love to add it into my work. So, my friends, we've covered a lot of territory today. For those of you that have hung in there, thank you so much. I know we've been here about an hour and a half now, covering the history, creating a floral press, talking about different ways to arrange it, getting it printed on some beautiful Spoonflower textiles, and then embellishing that with embroidery. To close out, do we have any questions before we wrap it up?
Robert, we've got one question from Lauren, which I think is really great, who says, how color fast is the embroidery, and does the,
focus.
Does it limit the use of the finished work, which, considering, it's going to be a tea towel hanging in the kitchen? I think that's a great question. So
that is a really great question. All embroidery floss from the big companies like DMC and Anchor are made to be color fast. And it will say so usually on the label at some point, that it is color fast. So they are meant to be stitched and can be laundered regularly and should maintain their color beautifully.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, and Robert, I owe you an apology, because that was absolutely my oversight at the beginning of this introduction. This is your 4th Craft Friday with us.
It is my 4th one.
Your first one predated me, which is why I missed it. But yes, so thank you for joining us again for your 4th Craft Friday with us.
Are you kidding me? It's my pleasure. And like I said, I love that you guys set aside this sort of thoughtful time to focus on creativity. The holidays get to be a little bananas, and I think it's a really nice opportunity just to even momentarily center yourself. Even if you're not going to tackle this project and you were curious and just wanted to learn more about it, I think that kind of enriches the soul, and it's a good way to kind of navigate your way through the holiday season.
Well, the chat is filled with some really beautiful and lovely comments for you.
Oh, that's so nice.
And for those of you who are still in the chat, Jesse and I are going to share out a survey link very quickly. And please click that link and open it up so that you can share your feedback with us. And we can continue to create the types of webinars and events that you would like to join. And then, of course, don't forget to snap a photo of your finished project and share to Instagram with the hashtag Spoonflower Craft Friday, also tagging Spoonflower and Robert Mahar. And thank you all for being here. And we hope to see you for our next and final Craft Friday session next week.
I love that. And Alexa, before we close, I'll just add two more things, if I could, very quickly.
Of course.
If you want to get your hands on one of the Spoonflower tea towels that I created, you can find this in my Spoonflower shop, and there'll be a link in the blog tutorial that'll lead you right there. The practice fabric that I used today is also available there. And then my own personal website, which is robertmahar.com or robert-mahar.com. Either one will get you there. Also has a variety of tutorials on there, some of which are embroidery if you want to explore that a little bit further. And like Alexa said, if you take pictures of works in progress or your finished pieces, we would love for you to tag and share them with us. I always come into these projects with a little bit of a preconceived idea of what they're going to look like. I let them loose on a room full of students, and you all take it in a million different directions, which I think is super inspiring. So again, thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate your time and your interest. And happy stitching and pressing.
Thank you, Robert.
All right. Thank you, friends.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.